By October of 1781, Charles Cornwallis had a British army inside Yorktown, Virginia, but no reliable way to get it out. French warships controlled the Chesapeake Bay. Allied artillery was moving into position on land. Trenches were advancing toward the British defenses a few yards at a time. Cornwallis commanded veteran troops of the empire that had ruled the Atlantic for generations. Yet the army was becoming a prisoner of its own fortifications. Among the men helping hold that trap closed was Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette. He was 24 years old. 5 years earlier, he had been a French teenager with wealth, a title, a cavalry commission, and no experience of combat. He had crossed an ocean to join a rebellion that looked, to many Europeans, like a reckless and probably doomed colonial uprising. Lafayette did not win the American Revolution alone. No individual did. The war depended on soldiers who endured years of shortages, on American political persistence, on French money and weapons, and finally on French soldiers and naval power. But Lafayette helped connect those worlds. He became Washington's trusted subordinate, a public symbol of the alliance with France, a determined advocate for American support in Paris, and a commander who kept Cornwallis occupied in Virginia until the larger Allied plan could take shape. How did an orphaned French aristocrat become so deeply committed to an American cause? And how did a young volunteer, initially treated with caution by the Continental Congress, earn a place at the center of the campaign that changed the war? The answer begins not on a battlefield, but in the highly ordered world he chose to leave behind. Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Rochambeau du Motier was born on September 6, 1757, at the Château de Chavagnac in Auvergne, in south-central France. He inherited a long name and an older military tradition. His father, Michel-Louis Christophe Roch Gilbert Paulette du Motier, was a colonel in the French Grenadiers. In 1759, at the Battle of Minden during the 7 Years' War, he was killed fighting the British. Accounts commonly identify a cannonball as the fatal shot. Lafayette was only 2. His mother died when he was 13, leaving him an orphan with a substantial inheritance and extensive family connections. In the world of 18th century France, those advantages were not simply private comforts. They placed him within a military and courtly elite whose members were expected to serve the crown, marry strategically, and preserve their estates. At 14, Lafayette entered the Royal Military Academy at Versailles. At 16, he married Marie-Adrienne Françoise de Noailles, whose family stood close to the royal court. He held a commission as a cavalry officer. By the standards of his society, his future appeared secure. He could have pursued rank in the French army, managed his property, and lived the polished life expected of a young marquis. But France in the 1770s was also a place of political argument. Writers of the Enlightenment had challenged inherited authority and debated liberty, representation, and the rights of citizens. Across the Atlantic, British colonists had moved from protest into armed resistance. In July of 1776, their representatives declared independence from Britain. The news traveled quickly through European diplomatic circles and private salons. For French leaders, the conflict offered an opportunity and a danger. Britain was France's great rival, and a successful American rebellion could weaken British power. At the same time, openly aiding rebels against a king risked war before France was ready. French support therefore moved at first through indirect channels: supplies, loans, private ventures, and diplomacy conducted with careful deniability. For Lafayette, the American struggle carried a more personal charge. Britain was the power associated with his father's death, and the language of liberty gave his military ambitions a moral frame. He was not yet a tested officer. He was a 19-year-old nobleman drawn toward a distant war by conviction, rivalry, and a desire to prove himself. In December of 1776, Lafayette met Silas Deane in Paris. Deane, an American diplomat, was recruiting officers and seeking support for the Continental cause. The Americans needed trained men, material aid, and influential friends in Europe. Lafayette offered more than battlefield experience, which he did not possess. He brought money, social standing, and access to circles that could make the American rebellion harder for Britain to dismiss. On December 7th, Dean signed an agreement listing Lafayette as a major general and promised, in the name of Congress, that Lafayette would receive the rank. But this was not yet a formal Continental Army commission. Dean asked Congress to confirm the arrangement and issue the commission later. Lafayette, for his part, declared that he would serve without a pension or special allowance. That decision distinguished him from many foreign volunteers who expected pay, command, or prestige in return. His departure was not simple. France was not formally at war with Britain, and French officials had reason to prevent a conspicuous aristocrat from openly joining the rebels. Later accounts often presented Lafayette as defying a personal order from King Louis XVI. More recent archival research casts doubt on the supposed royal order itself. What is clear is that his plan was controversial, opposed by people close to him, and politically awkward for the French government. Lafayette committed his own resources to an expedition. He obtained the vessel La Victoire and assembled officers willing to sail with him. The total financial arrangements for the ship, cargo, insurance, and expedition were substantial, though the exact purchase price of the vessel cannot be securely separated from the wider costs. To avoid interference, the expedition departed from Los Pasajes, now Pasaya, on the northern coast of Spain. On April 20, 1777, La Victoire sailed westward. The journey across the Atlantic was a practical test of Lafayette's decision. A merchant vessel was not designed for comfort in heavy seas. Storms, sickness, limited supplies, and the threat of British naval interception turned the voyage into more than a youthful gesture. Capture would have ended his mission before it reached America and created an international embarrassment for everyone involved. In mid-June, La Victoire reached the coast near Georgetown, South Carolina, arriving at North Island or South Inlet. Accounts differ by a day, placing the landing on June 13th or June 14th. The small discrepancy matters less than the larger fact. Lafayette had arrived in a country he knew largely through reports and ideas, carrying a promise of rank that Congress had not yet formally approved. The America he encountered did not resemble Versailles. Roads were rough, settlements were scattered, and the institutions of government were improvised by necessity. The rebellion had declared grand principles, but it was fighting with uncertain revenues, competing state interests, short enlistments, and an army that frequently lacked food, clothing, ammunition, and transport. Lafayette traveled north toward Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress faced a difficult problem. European officers had been arriving with letters of recommendation and extravagant expectations. Some had genuine ability, others had little practical value. Congress already had more generals than it could comfortably employ, and assigning high rank to foreign volunteers could offend American officers who had risen through service in the field. Lafayette's youth made the situation more delicate. He was rich, titled, and unknown in America. A major general's commission for a teenager who had never fought could have seemed absurd. Yet he did not insist on an independent command. He offered his service without pay and made clear that he had come to learn as well as to fight. That posture changed the reception he received. On July 31, 1777, Congress formally granted Lafayette the rank and commission of Major General. It was an unusual honor, but it did not immediately place troops under his command. In part, it was diplomatic. His presence linked the American cause to a young man from one of France's prominent families. In part, it was a wager that his enthusiasm could become useful service rather than another administrative problem. Days later, Lafayette met George Washington in Philadelphia. Washington was 45, leading an army that had suffered severe reverses around New York and was now trying to protect the revolutionary government from a British advance. Lafayette was still learning English and still discovering the practical limits of his rank. Their relationship developed quickly, shaped by temperament as well as political usefulness. Washington had lost his father as a child. Lafayette had lost both parents young. Washington had no surviving biological sons. Lafayette was looking for guidance from an older commander, whose authority seemed both military and personal. Over time, Washington treated him with unusual warmth, while Lafayette offered intense loyalty. Their bond would be described in the language of family, but it was also a working partnership formed under pressure. Washington brought the young Frenchman into his military circle. Lafayette observed senior officers, attended discussions, and confronted the unromantic mechanics of the war. Disputes with Congress, unreliable militia service, shortages of wagons and horses, and the difficulty of keeping an army intact when enlistments expired. He trained with American troops and worked to improve his English. The title he had brought from France mattered less than whether he could become useful. His first major test came quickly. On September 11, 1777, British forces under General William Howe attacked the American army near Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. Howe used a flanking movement to strike the American right. The maneuver exposed the weakness of Washington's intelligence and the difficulty of coordinating units across wooded, broken ground. The American line gave way in confusion. Lafayette had initially been assigned to observe, but he rode into the fighting and tried to help rally retreating troops. During the battle, a musket ball wounded his left leg. His aides urged him to leave the field. He remained long enough to assist with the retreat before receiving treatment. Brandywine was an American defeat, and Philadelphia soon fell to the British. But Lafayette's conduct altered how many American officers saw him. He had not arrived merely to collect a title. He had been wounded under fire while trying to steady soldiers in a collapsing battle. Washington took a close interest in his recovery and reportedly instructed the surgeons to care for Lafayette as they would for his own son. Lafayette spent months recovering, including time in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He wrote home to Adrian and continued to speak forcefully for the American cause. By December, he had returned to the army as it went into winter quarters at Valley Forge. There, the revolution confronted a threat no British assault could solve by itself: the slow destruction of an army through hunger, exposure, disease, and discouragement. About 12,000 soldiers entered the camp at Valley Forge in December of 1777. They built huts on the frozen ground outside British-occupied Philadelphia. The popular image of the winter is sometimes simplified, but the underlying hardship was real. Supply failures left many men without adequate clothing, blankets, shoes, or food. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Soldiers died from illness and deprivation. Many others deserted or became unfit for duty. The crisis was partly logistical and partly political. Congress lacked dependable taxing power. The states competed for limited goods and struggled to meet quotas. Food could exist in the countryside yet fail to reach the army because money, wagons, roads, contracts, and authority all broke down at once. Washington had to preserve a fighting force while persuading civilian leaders to reform the system that supplied it. Lafayette remained with the army rather than withdrawing into privilege. He used personal funds to help obtain necessities and shared much of the army's hardship. His presence did not solve the supply crisis, but it mattered to men who could see whether a commander accepted the conditions imposed on ordinary soldiers. In an army held together by endurance, trust was a form of military strength. That winter also brought a challenge to Washington's command. Frustration after defeats had encouraged a group of officers and politicians to look toward General Horatio Gates, recently celebrated for the American victory at Saratoga. The maneuver became known as the Conway Cabal, after General Thomas Conway, one of the critics associated with it. The effort was not a single, neatly organized coup, but it exposed divisions inside the revolutionary leadership. Lafayette was offered an independent command connected to a projected invasion of Canada. For a young major general seeking distinction, the offer might have been tempting. It also carried a political purpose. Separating Lafayette from Washington could weaken one of Washington's loyal supporters. Lafayette accepted the assignment in principle, but wrote directly to Washington, affirming his loyalty. When he reached the Northern Theater, the proposed expedition proved poorly prepared. It lacked the troops, supplies, and coordination needed for a serious advance. Lafayette refused to manufacture a glorious failure from an impossible plan. The episode embarrassed the project and helped reveal the weakness of the coalition working against Washington. The consequences were larger than the Canada expedition itself. Washington retained command. The army did not fracture into competing personal factions. The Continental cause still faced enormous military problems, but its central command survived one of the moments when political distrust could have done more damage than British fire. Lafayette soon had an opportunity to demonstrate judgment in the field. In May of 1778, near Barren Hill outside Philadelphia, he led a force of roughly 2,000 men into an exposed position. A larger British force moved to cut him off. The British expected to trap the young French commander between their advance and the terrain around the Schuylkill River. Lafayette recognized the danger in time. Rather than fight a battle his force could not win, he used available roads and a narrow route toward the river to withdraw. The maneuver preserved his command and denied the British the capture they had hoped for. It was not a dramatic victory measured in seized ground, but it showed the discipline to avoid one. In a war of limited resources, saving an army could matter as much as defeating an enemy. By 1779, Lafayette's value extended beyond American command arrangements. France had signed an alliance with the United States in February of 1778. After the American victory at Saratoga helped persuade French leaders that the rebellion had a chance of success. The treaty transformed the conflict into a wider war between European powers. Yet an alliance on paper was not the same as a decisive French military commitment in North America. Lafayette returned to France in January of 1779. He arrived with a visible wound, first-hand experience, and a reputation that made him an effective advocate. In Paris, he could describe the American army not as an abstraction, but as an institution he had served in, brave, vulnerable, often underfed, and in need of sustained assistance rather than ceremonial sympathy. He worked alongside Benjamin Franklin, the American representative in France. Though their strengths were different, Franklin carried diplomatic authority and international stature. Lafayette carried the urgency of a French nobleman who had risked his life for the American cause. He met officials, pressed the case for troops and naval support, and argued that France could weaken Britain by committing forces where they could make a strategic difference. French support had already begun, and Lafayette was not its sole architect. The French monarchy made decisions according to its own interests, calculations, and fears. But Lafayette helped make America visible within the French political world. He was evidence that the alliance had human stakes, and that French involvement could bring both strategic advantage and public prestige. By 1780, France sent a substantial expeditionary force under General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau. Roughly 6,000 professional French soldiers arrived in Rhode Island. A French fleet also operated in American waters, though naval plans remained constrained by distance, weather, British strength, and the need to coordinate with the Caribbean. The alliance was now real, but its success depended on timing. Lafayette returned to America in the spring of 1780. The war had entered a dangerous phase. Britain shifted major attention to the south, where it hoped to exploit Yorktown and regain control colony by colony. British troops captured Charleston, South Carolina in 1780, a serious American disaster. The struggle then moved through the Carolinas and into Virginia. In Virginia, Cornwallis commanded battle-tested British regulars and pursued a campaign intended to break American resistance, disrupt supplies, and punish militia activity. Lafayette was eventually placed in command of a smaller American force in the region. He had no reason to seek an open-field battle. Cornwallis had more experienced troops, stronger formations, and the advantages that came with a concentrated professional army. Lafayette's task was therefore defensive in an active sense. He moved across Virginia, watched British movements, preserved his force, and looked for opportunities to strike detachments, threaten supply lines, or force Cornwallis to spend time and energy reacting. The objective was not a single brilliant clash. It was to keep an enemy army from acting freely. This campaign demanded restraint. A commander who stood and fought at the wrong moment could lose everything in an afternoon. Lafayette repeatedly withdrew when Cornwallis tried to bring him to battle, then reappeared when the British marched on. The pattern frustrated British hopes for a decisive engagement. It also kept an American force alive in the theater while larger plans developed beyond Virginia. Cornwallis moved toward the coast. In the summer of 1781, he established himself around Yorktown on the York River, where he began strengthening defensive works. The location offered a harbor and the prospect of supply or evacuation by sea. British strategy still assumed that naval power could connect on the Virginia coast to the wider empire. That assumption contained the vulnerability that Lafayette and the Allied commanders needed. On land, the British could build redoubts, dig earthworks, and use disciplined troops to defend a narrow peninsula. But Yorktown could not be held indefinitely if a hostile fleet controlled the Chesapeake. The future of the campaign would depend on an alignment of armies, ships, weather, schedules, and secrecy. Washington and Rochambeau had initially considered operations against British-held New York. Then intelligence and communications from the Caribbean created another possibility. Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse could bring a French fleet north toward the Chesapeake. If the fleet arrived in time and defeated or blocked the Royal Navy, Cornwallis could be isolated. Washington and Rochambeau chose to move south. The decision required a remarkable logistical effort. Allied troops had to march hundreds of miles from the New York area toward Virginia, without giving Britain a clear early warning of their destination. French and American forces coordinated roads, boats, provisions, artillery, and river crossings. The campaign depended on speed, but speed alone was not enough. Every movement had to converge on the coast before Cornwallis could escape. Lafayette's troops continued to observe and contain the British while this convergence unfolded. Their role was not to destroy Cornwallis alone. It was to prevent him from using the time before the main Allied armies arrived to break away or overwhelm the smaller American force. In that sense, Lafayette's Virginia campaign was the patient first half of the Yorktown victory. The decisive naval event came in early September. At the Battle of the Chesapeake, de Grasse's fleet fought a British naval force and prevented it from opening the bay to Cornwallis. The engagement did not annihilate the Royal Navy, but it produced the strategic result that mattered. British ships withdrew, and the French controlled the waters Cornwallis needed. The effect was immediate. Reinforcement, resupply, and evacuation by sea became uncertain or impossible. The British army at Yorktown was no longer merely defending a position. It was waiting for help that could not reliably reach it. On land, Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette's troops, and other American and French forces closed in. Positions around the York River and Gloucester Point reduced the remaining routes of escape. By late September, about 17,000 Allied troops faced Cornwallis's force. The Allies began a formal siege, a methodical form of warfare designed to overpower fortified positions with engineering and artillery. Soldiers dug parallel trenches, protected by earth and timber, gradually moving their works closer to the British lines. Guns were hauled through difficult ground and placed where they could concentrate fire. On October 9th, the bombardment began. Heavy artillery fired into British defenses, damaging works, buildings, and ships in the harbor. Washington is traditionally credited with firing the opening shot from the American side. Whether remembered for that symbolic moment or not, his larger role was unmistakable. He had brought the American army and French alliance together at precisely the point where sea power could convert a siege into a trap. The bombardment made daily life inside Yorktown increasingly untenable. British troops could not easily repair damage, move between positions, or rest without exposure. Yet the defenses still included two advanced fortified posts, redoubts 9 and 10. Those positions obstructed the construction of a second Allied parallel close enough to bring cannon fire directly against the inner British works. They had to be taken. On the night of October 14th, Allied assault columns moved against both redoubts. American troops led by Colonel Alexander Hamilton attacked Redoubt 10. French troops attacked Redoubt 9 at the same time. To preserve surprise, the Americans were ordered to advance with unloaded muskets, relying on bayonets and the speed of the assault rather than early gunfire. The attackers crossed open ground under fire, cut through obstacles, climbed into the defenses, and fought at close quarters. The American attack captured Redoubt 10 in roughly 10 minutes. The French assault on Redoubt 9 also succeeded, though it took longer. The operations were brief, violent, and consequential. The two positions gave the Allies the ground needed to extend their siege works and aim artillery more directly into the British defenses. Cornwallis attempted to find a way out, but the basic geometry of the campaign had not changed. French naval power still blocked the Chesapeake. Allied armies held the landward approaches. The siege guns were now closer and more destructive. Yorktown's defenses had become a shrinking enclosure rather than a shield. On October 17th, a British drummer appeared with a white flag to seek terms. 2 days later, on October 19th, Cornwallis's army surrendered. About 8,000 British troops laid down their arms. The story that the British band played, "The World Turned Upside Down," is famous, though historians have treated the detail cautiously. The larger reversal needs no embellishment. Britain had lost an entire field army in North America. Yorktown did not legally end the war that day. Fighting and diplomacy continued, and the Treaty of Paris was not signed until September of 1783. Britain still possessed military power, and the conflict remained part of a global struggle involving France, Spain, and other interests. But the surrender shattered British confidence that the colonies could be brought back under control at an acceptable cost. The political will for a prolonged American war weakened sharply. Lafayette emerged from Yorktown as a figure known on both sides of the Atlantic. Americans saw a foreign volunteer who had come without a salary, learned their difficult war, suffered a wound, and stayed through the bleakest years. In France, he represented both the humiliation of Britain and the attraction of American constitutional ideas. His fame rested on real service, but also on symbolism. He made the alliance between republic and monarchy visible in human form. That symbolism would follow him into a more dangerous revolution in his own country. In 1789, as France entered crisis, Lafayette helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The document drew from several intellectual traditions, including ideas associated with the American Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Lafayette also commanded the National Guard in Paris during the early phase of the French Revolution. He sent George Washington a key from the Bastille, the prison fortress whose fall became an emblem of the Revolution. The gesture linked the two revolutions in a single object. The key remains at Mount Vernon, a reminder that Lafayette had imagined the French struggle as an extension, rather than a rejection of the political principles he had encountered in America. But France did not follow the moderate constitutional path Lafayette hoped to defend. He tried to navigate between royal authority and radical revolution. In the escalating violence of the early 1790s, both sides distrusted him. Declared a traitor, he fled France and was captured by Austrian forces. He spent years in imprisonment under harsh conditions. Adrian, meanwhile, was imprisoned in France and narrowly survived the Reign of Terror. Released in 1797, Lafayette returned eventually to French public life. Under Napoleon, and later under restored Bourbon rule, he continued to support constitutional government and individual liberty. His political career was neither simple nor consistently triumphant. The man celebrated for crossing the Atlantic in pursuit of freedom spent much of his later life confronting the limits, contradictions, and dangers of revolution in Europe. In 1824, Lafayette made a final celebrated journey to the United States. The country had grown far beyond the fragile collection of states he had joined in 777. He visited all 24 states over 16 months. Crowds greeted him in cities and towns, while aging veterans of the Revolution saw in him a surviving connection to the war that had made the nation possible. Congress granted him $200,000 and a large tract of land in Florida. Communities across the United States took his name: Lafayette, Louisiana, Fayetteville, North Carolina, LaGrange, Georgia, and many others. The names reflected more than fashion. They marked a durable American gratitude toward a man who had entered the Revolution as an outsider and came to be treated as one of its own. Lafayette died in Paris on May 20, 1834, at the age of 76. He was buried beneath soil brought from Bunker Hill, binding his grave to the country whose independence he had helped secure. He had lived long enough to see the American Revolution become national memory, and to see France pass through empire, restoration, and renewed upheaval. His importance lies not in a simple claim that one young Frenchman saved the United States. The American victory had many makers, and French intervention was the decision of a state pursuing its own interests. Yet Lafayette helped make that intervention more politically compelling. He gave Washington loyalties when the Continental Army needed cohesion. In Virginia, he preserved an American force against Cornwallis until naval and military reinforcements could close the trap. The contradiction at the center of his life remains the source of its power. Lafayette began as a privileged aristocrat, born into the structure of old regime France. He became an advocate for a revolution overseas, then a constitutional reformer in a revolution at home. He was young enough to be dismissed, wealthy enough to leave when hardship arrived, and inexperienced enough to fail early. Instead, he learned, endured, and accepted risks that his inheritance never required him to take. At Yorktown, the French volunteer who had arrived in America with little more than a promise of rank stood within a coalition powerful enough to defeat a British army. The road from Chesapeake to Virginia had passed through injury, winter camps, political intrigue, diplomacy, retreat, and alliance. Lafayette's achievement was not that he acted alone. It was that he understood earlier than most that liberty would need friends across an ocean, and then chose to become one.